I'll go ahead and get started, and we'll just go from there. So I'm talking today about a program that EPA has rolled out in the last year or so, and it's EPA's Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, and it's a planning and implementation program through the IRA. Has anyone heard of this program or familiar with it at all before I get started here? No? Okay. Well, good. So brief introduction. So I'm with Olson. We're a national full-service engineering and design firm. We're headquartered in Nebraska. We have about 2,000 employees nationwide, and I'm in the environmental discipline. I'm a technical expert within our environmental discipline. I started my career out as a air permit engineer for the state of Nebraska, working on air permits for utilities back in the Midwest, ethanol plants, manufacturing facilities, and then in about 2005 I moved out to Sacramento and worked for an environmental consulting company that's now part of HDR, doing a lot of federal work. So at that time the government had an executive order that George Bush had signed called Greening the Government Through Environment, and one of the key elements of that program was the development of systems to help those organizations manage their environmental programs proactively. So it's based on an ISO standard, ISO 14001 for environmental management systems. So I spent quite a bit of my time in the mid-2000s working with these federal facilities on implementing these types of systems. And then in the 2010-12 period, some of that management system work started to move a little bit more into the space of sustainable buildings. So the federal government had a program to start evaluating their assets against some sustainability standards. So kind of got involved in that a little bit. Managed a couple of consulting companies with a few partners for a number of years, and I've been at Olson for about 5 years now. So background is pretty heavy in kind of the nuts and bolts of regulatory permitting and compliance, but I've also spent quite a bit of my time with management systems and climate sustainability and resilience work. So with that, here's what we're going to be covering today. I'm going to give you a brief overview of this CPRG program, and then we're going to dive into the details of the Notice of Funding opportunity, which really is the nuts and bolts of how you get access to this implementation grant money. We'll talk about just kind of high level some GHG emission profiles for the purposes of evaluating the success that you might be able to achieve with this grant program, and then share some implementation measures in the energy space. Good morning, welcome. We're just getting started, so it's all good. Okay, so here are a few highlights of this program. So EPA has awarded about $250 million to states and the largest 67 MSAs to do climate planning. This is non-matching grant funding for these organizations to basically put together a climate plan if they haven't done so, or if they do have one, to update that plan. And these grant recipients, they just basically, you get the money, there's not a lot of strings attached. It's basically you need to apply for it, and they give you the money. And the states, I think all states but two, elected to participate in the program. And again, there were 67 MSAs that are participating. In addition, tribal entities have access to both planning and implementation grant funding as well. So those planning grants require that all these plans be submitted to EPA by March 1st. And most people have not received their grant money until about 6 months ago. So it's been really all over the country. States and MSAs and other political or government organizations have really been scrambling to pull together their plans in order to meet that deadline. And why that planning implementation or planning grant is really causing a lot of challenges for people is that you have to basically describe in that plan what you want to be able to implement with the implementation grant funding. And those implementation grants applications are due April 1st. So there's a really tight time frame to get your plan into EPA so that you can then turn around and a month later submit a pretty rigorous application to request funding for implementation. So EPA is going to award $4.6 billion in competitive grants for measures developed under the CPRG planning grant. These grants will be between $2 million and $500 million, and there's funding tiers. They're going to say we're going to give this many in this tier and this many in that tier. This is a competitive grant program, so if you're in Fayetteville, Arkansas, you could be competing for a grant with Salt Lake City, Utah, or San Diego. So it's a pretty challenging process for organizations to come together quickly, prioritize what's important to them, and then get into this implementation grant phase. But non-matching grant funding, so again, $4.6 billion available to states, local governments, and tribes to implement elements of their plans. So with some of the clients that we're working with on these plans, we're really focusing on the end goal with them. In other words, what is going to help you be successful when you want to obtain implementation grant funding? And so we're going to get into the details of the notice of funding here, because this is really the nuts and bolts of, as you put your plan together, thinking with the end in mind, what do we need to be looking at when we are identifying what should be a priority for our community? So as the slide says here, EPA intends to award 30 to 115 grants ranging from $2 to $500 million. The applications for grants must seek to implement funding measures that are included into this priority climate action plan that I mentioned. And there are these funding tiers. Applications will be evaluated against others in the same tier. A couple of other caveats that are really challenging for a lot of organizations as they're looking at how they can come together to obtain this funding are: one, eligible applicants, you can apply as a coalition, but you cannot submit multiple applications for the same set of GHG reduction measures using different lead applicants. And an eligible application may submit only one application as an individual applicant and one as a lead applicant. So where this gets challenging, I'll give you an example in the state of Oklahoma. So the state is putting together a plan. They are evaluating how to pursue implementation measures. The city of Oklahoma City and the city of Tulsa also have received funding, and they're looking at some of these measures. If these organizations aren't communicating and they both pursue the same measures, EPA is basically saying, hey, we're going to only award one grant, implementation grant, for in this area for this type of issue. So if the state pursues it and say Oklahoma City does, and they're not talking, only one of them will get that. So it's really creating a lot of opportunities for some collaboration, but also some challenges. The last bullet here, a little bit cut off at the bottom, but grants are intended to support measures for which dedicated funding from other sources is unavailable, right? But the key here is that, or that leverage other sources of public funding to the extent possible prior to CPRG funding. So there are a lot of other programs out there for which people can obtain funding, whether it's for zero emission vehicles, electric charging stations, and EPA is really asking folks to kind of say, hey, this is why we also need this money, or this is why we need this money because this other program over here won't allow us to tap into that. Okay, so I'm going to get into a little bit more detail on this notice of funding. So think about this as a test, right? And EPA is going to get a couple hundred applications this summer. They're trying to distribute all these funds this calendar year to meet some, say, politically driven deadlines internally for the federal government. So the first element of the scoring is summary and approach. So we have 45 points, or 18% of the points, that identify or address these three elements here. So 20 points is just for the description of the measures. How well are you articulating basically what you're going to do and how you're going to maybe collaborate with others in order to do that. Demonstration of funding needs. So this would be where you'd be looking at what other programs are available, or what do we need to do with this money because we can't enable or energize that program through other grants. And then 15 points for transformative impact. So what they're looking for here is, hey, what are you going to do that is really going to change maybe the way of doing business in your community? We have seen a number of communities and community comments come in about things like composting and recycling. And those are valuable programs, but you know, when you start thinking about transformative impact and changing the way of how we do things, you know, perhaps those programs might not score out well when you look at, is this really a transformative impact, as an example. So 60 points, or 12%, is about the GHG reduction, right? So what we're talking about here is decarbonizing, right? So when an applicant puts an implementation grant application forward, they really need to be describing, well, what is that quantified benefit of emission reduction? So the first element, 20 points, is what is that reduction from 2025 through 2030? And then the next one is 2025 through 2050. The next one, 15 points for the cost effectiveness, and then 15 points for documentation of reduction assumptions. So there's another area of the country that we've been working with, and we are talking to them a lot about kind of the elephant in the room, and that might be power, that might be transportation. And these are big pieces of the pie to really decarbonize. But in areas where maybe there's not as much political will to pursue some of these measures, some people are interested in pursuing some other things like green corridors. That could be beneficial in a number of different ways. You might have some carbon sequestration benefits. Maybe that's makes the area a little bit more amenable to biking and multimodal transportation. But when you look at a measure like that and you start thinking about, well, if those green corridors consist of us buying land, acquiring land, and then we're going to get a little bit of carbon sequestration out of that. When you think about the cost effectiveness of that compared to maybe other measures that could be implemented, you might start to need to really be honest with yourself and your organization about could we really be competitive against another organization somewhere else in the country that might be pursuing something perhaps in the transportation EV space or in the distributed power space, renewable generation, that might be more cost effective. So what we're just trying to do is remind our clients, just put yourself in the shoes of EPA this summer, getting 200 applications in and having to kind of go through and be able to understand the story that applicant's telling you about why this measure makes sense. Okay, next is the outputs and outcomes. So, of course, one of the first outputs and outcomes would be a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But this program is looking for applicants to really be able to describe, well, what other benefits could be derived from this program? An easy example to cite would be co-pollutant benefits. So whether it's dealing with ozone or criteria pollutant emissions, typically a lot of these decarbonization initiatives would have co-benefit reduction pollutants as well. There could be some positive social benefit outcomes to some of these programs in terms of quality of life. So that's something you're asked to address. Performance and measures and plan. This is where EPA is looking for the applicant to be able to describe, look, this is how we're going to measure our own success and hold ourselves accountable for what we're trying to do. And then it's only 10 points. This is out of 250 points total, so only 10 points here. But the authority to implement implementation timeline and milestones is a pretty critical component here. So when we think about authority, what this means is you as an applicant, do you have the authority to basically take this money, 20, 30, $100 million, and be able to distribute it to the entities that you're saying would be implementing the programs that are under your grant application? Implementation timeline, I think, is pretty self-explanatory, but you need to be able to really lay out when you're going to take the various steps to meet your measure, and then what milestones you'll have in place. So one of the things that I've seen is quite challenging, and I think we see this around the country. I know you're from California. I think an internal auditor for LA County or the city of Los Angeles had looked at all these climate plans around the country and found that a lot of them are pretty good at pretty high levels saying, hey, these are our buckets of emissions, and here's our goal, and this is what we're committing to doing. But we're here, and here's our goal. But all those intermediate steps maybe aren't very well laid out. And so this program is really pushing people to get specific about what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, how much it's going to cost. And so really the rubber's meeting the road here with this program, which I think is great to kind of hold people accountable for some of these maybe altruistic goals they've set. LIDAC. So this is low income and disadvantaged communities. So this is EPA putting into this grant program a requirement that basically 14% of the scoring is based on how much benefit your program will have for low income and disadvantaged communities. So You can see 10 points is for community engagement. The application process for the implementation grant describes what you should be doing in your communities to engage people in your communities. And you need to be able to describe how the measures that you're putting forward are going to disproportionately advantage low-income and disadvantaged communities. So EPA has actually developed a tool to do a LIDAC analysis to identify these communities in your region. There are other tools out there that you can use as well. Only 5 points for jobs, but we do have an element here where EPA is saying, hey, you're going to roll something out, you want some money from us. What does this do in terms of job creation in our community? Say that again.
A. The A up there.
Oh, disadvantaged.
Disadvantaged is
Yeah.
2 letters for disadvantaged.
I think so.
Disadvantaged is 1 word.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, scoring, moving on to the next category here. So again, we're out of 250 points total. 30 points is capability or past performance. So have you demonstrated as an organization, whether that's a city or a regional planning commission, that you've implemented measures like you're looking to undertake through this program? What kind of reporting requirements do you have in place, and can you demonstrate that you've got kind of the process in place to be able to administer a grant like this? And then what staff expertise do you have? We're doing some work in Northwest Arkansas with Bentonville, Fayetteville, Rogers, and Springdale. So this is an area of the country where we have Walmart, Tyson, and J.B. Hunt. So we have a lot of shipping and transportation that it kind of resides or originates out of that location. And a grantee is the Northwest Regional Planning Commission. And so they are our client, and they have basically said, look, we're a transportation agency. So if we decide to pursue an implementation grant, we might be interested in distributed power, we might be interested in building efficiency, but as a transportation entity, we really need to be looking at those measures that kind of line up with our mission, because we can show through past performance that we can manage large grant applications for transportation programs. Staff expertise is another challenging one. A lot of organizations that maybe haven't really moved into this space of what I'd call climate and resilience planning are really struggling with having adequate staff in place to manage what is a pretty large grant program if they were to pursue this. So EPA is saying here 10 points. Well, if you don't have a demonstrated capability with your staff to manage this, then we might not give you the money you're asking for. Okay, budget, another challenger. So think about this again. So you're doing your planning in your community, you're working with your cities, and you got to get your plan done by March 1st, and then you got to turn around by April 1 and get this implementation grant in. And a key component of that, 45 points or 18%, is your budget. So again, kind of going back to what I said a few minutes ago, you got this kind of pie in the sky plan. We're going to decarbonize by 2040 or 2050. Sounds good. But now this program is basically saying to you, look, you need to be able to lay out to us how you're going to spend this money that we're going to give you to meet that goal. So they have a pretty rigorous budget detail requirement. The reasonableness of costs is included in there, right? So if you think about people that maybe haven't undertaken projects to decarbonize in the past, and they need to, in the course of a month or maybe 2 months, kind of identify what a reasonable cost is, it's a pretty challenging undertaking here. And again, you're competing against everyone else in the country that's doing this work. So, those organizations that have been maybe working in this space a little bit more are probably a little bit advantaged because they probably have a little bit better intel on what the lift might take. Okay, so that was a lot to dive into the details of this notice of funding opportunity for the implementation grant, but thought that was important for everyone to understand because, again, as we're working with cities, states, and communities across the country, a lot of people have a lot of opinions about what they think is important, and we are really focused on staying disciplined with our clients and thinking about, hey, this is how you're going to be scored when you put your implementation grant forward. So keep these things in mind as you're evaluating the measures you're going to put into your priority plan. Okay, so switching gears here a little bit. The graph on the right is something I want to touch on here. As we're talking to people about, hey, what are you going to put in your plan? We're thinking about what are these transformative measures that you could undertake to really move the needle. So a simple way to think about this is we're working with stakeholders from cities and industry and the general public are, hey, in the United States, 25% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from power, about 28% transportation, 23% industry, 13% commercial and residential, primarily gas, and then agriculture. So as you're thinking, if you're only going to put a couple of measures in your plan, how you could move the needle the most, we really are driving people to keep this pie chart in mind for their own area of the country. So as an example, in Northwest Arkansas, we're looking at the state of Arkansas and their emissions profile. You'll notice here that in the state of Arkansas, emissions from agriculture are quite a bit higher than nationwide. You can see power and transportation still at the top. Commercial and residential is a little bit lower, and industry is at 16%. So each area of the country that's got one of these planning grants is basically asked to inventory their emissions in a similar way so that they can basically go to EPA and say, hey, this is our emissions profile in our community, and this is why we think this is important for us to be able to move the needle in this sector or series of sectors. So in what we keep reminding people, really tight time frames, is it's not about the exact number. It doesn't matter if it's 28 or 27 or 26 versus 16 or 17 or 15. It's more about the relative weight of each of these categories as you evaluate what you're going to be putting forward. So really the last thing I have to cover here with you is I wanted to share with you the example measures that EPA has put forward where they say, hey, if you want to put forth a measure that relates to the electric power sector, here are some examples of some measures that we would anticipate seeing from folks. So I think for this group, this would be a good one to spend a little time on. And I think there's maybe 6 or 8 of these total. So in the electric power sector, so renewable portfolio standards and clean energy standards, energy efficiency portfolio standards, emission trading systems, and GHG performance standards for electric generating units. So, you know, this isn't as much projects as it is kind of the regulatory framework within a community to perhaps drive or require change. So that's the series of measures that they've included. Next, so installation of renewable energy and storage systems on municipal facilities, programs to support smart grid and or behind-the-meter technologies to reduce power losses, reduce peak demand, and enable consumer participation in distributed generation. And then policies and measures to streamline permitting for renewable projects. So a couple of entities that we're working with, one of the things they're thinking about is, okay, well, distributed generation. What's going on in our kind of regulatory framework that would make this possible for us, or where are there some challenges where maybe there might be some laws in place that really disincentivize to some extent some distributed generation because of you know, maybe a political motive in a certain state that says, you know, we don't really want too much of this to come online, and we don't want it to maybe be competitive with our kind of our stationary sources. So we're gonna have some caps and rules on how much maybe distributed power we can allow. Policies and measures to streamline permitting for renewable energy projects. I think probably a number of us have seen that challenge as a real big barrier across the country. The last two here, so getting a little bit more into a carrot approach here. So, you know, what kind of incentives could an organization or a city implement where you've got incentives for people to install renewable energy and energy storage systems on commercial and residential buildings? This is a program that could be very well tailored to the LIDAC communities so that the incentives that are distributed by your community would be targeted to those most in need. And then, importantly, the development of distributed or community scale renewable energy generation, microgrids, or vehicle-to-grid infrastructure in disadvantaged communities. So those were 8 bullet items that EPA included in their notice of funding to basically describe the types of measures they would be looking for in their implementation grant applications. So that was a lot to cover, and I guess what I'd like to leave you with is, hey, this is a program that was everyone in the country was allowed to participate in. You're not required to participate in it. And when you look at the measures that EPA included in the notice of funding, I only showed you the measures for energy. But when you look across the board, really what I see is it's really a lot about infrastructure. And so when we go into certain areas maybe where the word climate, for example, is a little bit of a distraction for some people. I know not everyone understands why that would be, like you. But we can focus on infrastructure here and improvements to our infrastructure that I think benefit us all without really, I'm an engineer, right? So for me, focusing on the solution and what we're trying to accomplish is much more important to me than necessarily discussing why we need to be having this conversation. It's just, this is where we're at. We're talking about infrastructure. We've got some things that we've done a certain way in our country for 50 or 100 years, and we're making some changes. So this is a great program that really allows, what we're seeing in communities is people are coming together to talk about this from the angle of environment, infrastructure, social and community engagement, and low income and disadvantaged benefits. So it's kind of a nice program that EPA has pulled together. Unfortunately, on a very tight time frame, that's causing a lot of challenges. So with that, that's all I had. Happy to take a few questions.
Yeah, just a point that I think scientific information is important. It's not political at all. And not talking about science is a political decision to not talk about it. But that's not my question.
Okay.
My question is, you had measures down here, and I agree with all, they're nice measures. However, California has an official plan to achieve the 2030 climate stabilization requirement. And net zero also. You did mention net zero, and I just want to warn people that talking about 2045 net zero or 2050 net zero is extremely dangerous because 2030 is also a requirement. There's two climate stabilization requirements. 2030 is very soon. So, CARB, California Air Resources Board, was legislatively appointed the task of creating a plan to achieve the 2030 climate stabilization requirement and the 2045.
Yeah.
And Attorney General Harris, in her letter and in the lawsuit that she joined and so forth, talks about climate stabilization. So that's what it's about, and that's why in California you can't ignore it. But what's in that plan should be of interest to the EPA when they put down policies, because 2030 is so quick. They did pricing. Pricing is rather quick, and it's also cost effective. If you're charging nothing for something, and then now you decide to price it, you're not going to need as much of it. And they were very specific: car parking, and they were road use. Those are the top of the list. I didn't say anything at all about that. And it may be because you're not realizing that 2030 is also a requirement. It's quick. And being fair with people about money is actually very good for disadvantaged people. And their social equity, economic equity, that flows out of that. Our gasoline tax doesn't raise enough money. We're going to electrify the fleet. It has no future whatsoever. We need a means-based road use charge, and it has to be value-priced. Meaning, we're not going to take money that should go to homelessness or anything else, and instead make it cheap so I can drive my Tesla. I have a good income. I have a Tesla. I'm being heavily subsidized. Do the math. That's an enormous amount of money, not mentioned here. Note about the pricing. And parking should be operated for the financial gain of the people for who it is. If people are making minimum wage, they should make as much money from that parking as the guy that's the president of the company.
Yeah. And
that's social equity. So,
yeah. Did you have any questions or?
No, why isn't it breaking into what? Well, my question was, Have you looked at California? You know, it's a large, I think the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they have an official plan
Mm-hmm.
to achieve the 2030. So why
Right.
don't we look at that plan?
So, yeah.
Because they came out.
Yeah, so in the
December
context
2022.
of this program, basically what EPA says is, hey, state of California, you got a plan, that's great. So you can take that plan and use that for the purposes of this program.
Why would EPA look at the plan and say, we want to use that plan
Mm-hmm.
because you've actually addressed it seriously?
Yeah.
We're not Oklahoma.
Yeah, as a federal
We're not
government
Oklahoma.
agency, I mean, they
See, we
have to kind of look
Oklahoma
across the
has two
country.
senators that vote total climate denial. So
Who else? Okay, thank you. Yeah, Brian, what do you got?
Question. So,
Yeah.
I think you said this, but I just want to verify. Did you have to have one of those first grants in order to be able to apply for the implementation grant, or can somebody that already has a plan ready to go, could they apply for the implementation grant?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I don't think I was clear on that. So, yeah, you basically have to get the planning grant and put together a plan under that planning grant program in order to participate in the implementation grant program. Yeah.
So if you haven't done that ground work.
Yeah.
So off of that, is there any discussion to extend the deadline with it only being a month?
There's been a lot of discussion by the applicants, but no movement from
When was the
EPA.
notice given for this?
Well, within the
Last week or last year?
last 6 months.
6 months ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So no, they're trying to distribute these funds this year, so they're not trying to budge on the deadline. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming this morning. And Brian, would you like to take it away here?